Welcome to the Benson Wealth Podcast. I take complex financial and economic topics and make it accessible to the everyday listener. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Benson Wealth Podcast. My name is Drew Benson. I'm the president and founder of Benson Wealth Management, and I'm a senior wealth advisor with Raymond James. I'm also the co-managing partner for True North Wealth Management Group, which is a platform for independent wealth advisors. And look, if you're new to this podcast, I really try to bring unique content. So not only am I a certified financial planner and wealth advisor, but I'm also trained in macroeconomics. So I did my graduate work in economics and I worked at a consulting firm as an economist. So I try to fuse the ideas of finance, the markets, investing, financial planning with the macroeconomy. Today's subject is really a great fusion, by the way, because I've spent a lot of energy recently researching the Social Security system, because oftentimes I'm asked from clients, what is going to happen to my benefit one day when the Social Security trust funds run out? And by the way, they are set to run out in 2033. And so I want to answer that question and help you understand from a financial planning standpoint, how should you practically start to plan as you do your planning with your advisor? How should you plan for what a potential benefit could look like, particularly if you're someone that is more than 10 years or 10 years or more out from your full retirement age for Social Security? Because like I said, in less than 10 years, the trust funds are going to run out. So I'm going to get into the logistics of what that could look like. By the way, before you get too deep into this episode, I would encourage you that if you've not already listened to my interview with economist Andrew Biggs from last week, listen to that. It is a longer interview. It does run about an hour and a half, but he gets into so much deep and important information about the state of the Social Security system. By the way, he was the deputy director of the Social Security agency. He was one of the chief architects back in the early 2000s to help reform Social Security. Sadly, people did not take his advice, and I think we're starting to pay the price for not listening to people like Andrew. But it was a profound interview, and I learned an immense amount. And by the way, the reason I'm recording this whole episode today is that I've spent some time reflecting on his insights from that interview, and now I want to start to talk to you in a more practical sense of how you should plan or potentially plan or prepare for the possibility that your benefit may not be as big as it claims right now, because let's face it, the Social Security trust funds are going to run out in 2033. So again, go listen to Andrew Biggs. It was a fascinating and important interview, and probably one of the best interviews I've recorded since I started this podcast. And I think it'll give you a little bit more context into what I'm going to talk about today. So there's three things I want to talk to you about today. First is, let's go historically into how in the world did we get into this mess with the Social Security system? Because it wasn't always as financially unfeasible as it is today. So the system was pretty healthily run, I'll put it that way, up until a certain critical year. And so I want to go into the history of what happened to Social Security and how we got into this mess. And so in this first part of the podcast, I'm going to kind of give you the highlights of what I spoke to Andrew Biggs about. Then what I want to do is help you understand how to engage in financial planning with the uncertainty around what Social Security benefits could look like by 2033. And then lastly, I just want to give you some insights in how in the world do we get out of this mess, and what should you be thinking about, not just as an investor, but also as a citizen. So what should you be demanding of your members of Congress to help us clean up this situation with Social Security? And look, I'm not here to sell doom and gloom. I'm really here to sell you hope, because my goal on this podcast is to help highlight some of the problems of the Social Security system so that we can begin to restore it to a much more healthy state. But the longer we wait, the more severe the situation gets. And so my hope is that we can begin to, in a healthy and peaceful manner, pressure members of Congress to start to enact thoughtful reforms to Social Security. All right. How do we get into this mess? So there's two dates I want you to remember: 1977 and 2033, okay? These two dates are very important. So in 1977, that was a turning point where Social Security started to become insolvent. In fact, Social Security from the beginning, if you go back to 1935 when it was created, we didn't have financial issues with the program until 1977. In fact, it was quite healthy. So what in the world happened to Social Security? Because if you think about Social Security, in theory, it really should not be an insolvent program. The way the program has traditionally worked before 1977 is that when you would put money into the Social Security trust funds, and listen, it's a little more complicated this, but in a simple sense, if you think about it logically, if you put money into the program and they invest, say, with a risk-free rate of return, so say they invested in 10-year treasuries. Now, I'm not exactly sure what the Social Security trust funds specifically invest in. I do know they invest in treasuries. I just don't know which types of treasuries. But let's just assume, because there's a longer-term time horizon, they're going with, say, a 10-year treasury. Well, if the 10-year treasury is paying, right now it's paying about 4.5%. So if you put a certain amount of money in every year through payroll taxes, so by the way, if you are an employee in the United States, you're paying 6.2% of your income, and your employer is matching that with another 6.2%. So that's 12.4% of your income each year will get sent to the Social Security agency to provide a future benefit for you when you retire. Now, one of the naive perspectives I had is that Social Security owes me. Like, I paid into the Social Security program. You've paid into the Social Security program. This is not a social safety net. This is not a welfare program. This is me paying into the system, and I want my money back. So in theory, the program never should have become insolvent if you think about it, because if I put my money in and I got a risk-free rate of return and I reach a certain retirement age, they should be able to just basically pay me back what I paid into the system at interest. And by the way, that's exactly how the program, for the most part, worked up until 1977. Now, if you think about it, what we're all worried about today with Social Security is that we have a demographic problem. So if you go back in time, by the way, if you go back to, say, if you go back to 1960, for every retiree, there were 5.1 workers sustaining that one retiree. Now, if you fast forward to today, there's only 2.7 workers for every one retiree. And then if we fast forward to 2033, that's going to drop to 2.4 workers, right? That's the point at which the program becomes insolvent. Now, all that aside, again, back to my original point, if I pay into the program and I get a risk-free rate of return from the Treasury Department, why do the demographic issues even matter? It shouldn't matter. It doesn't matter how many people are in the program because we're all putting our proportionate amount in and we're getting our proportionate amount out. So what went wrong and why did the demographic issue become so severe? Because again, we've got two problems. One is that we have a demographic issue where we're having fewer and fewer and fewer children. Now, I'm doing my part with 7 kids, so you're welcome, Social Security. But for the rest of society, most of us in the United States have much lower fertility rates, which is putting a lot of pressure on the Social Security system. In addition to that, thanks to modern healthcare, thanks to better food that we're finally gaining access to, we are living longer and longer lives in the United States, and this is also making the program unsustainable. But I'll continue to go back to my original point. It wouldn't be unsustainable if we hadn't changed things in 1977. So I want you to listen to one of the clips from my interview last week from Andrew Biggs, and then I'll come back and talk to you a little bit more about what this means.
In 1977, they said, okay, we want to kind of make it automatic. And so they put aside, or they put together this expert commission, which actually included a guy named Peter Diamond, who was MIT and future Nobel Prize winner. And they looked at different ways of doing this, different ways of working the formula. And the commission unanimously said, okay, we want to go with this approach, which is kind of more modest. And what they said is this approach that they proposed, benefits would rise kind of slowly over time. And they said this will be affordable. If we want to raise them more, Congress can do it in the future. Instead, and this is coming from the Carter administration, they said, no, we want to lock in place this more generous formula where benefits are automatically going to increase at a higher rate. You know, next year's retirees are going to get benefits that are higher than this year's, and so on and so on and so on. Now, that formula, just as an example, a person retiring this year, the average person retiring this year gets a benefit, a monthly benefit that's about 40% higher than somebody retiring in 2000, even after factoring out inflation. So if you're somebody that says benefits haven't risen, A, you're wrong, but B, that's a function of that automatic formula. This, in my opinion, is when the Social Security crisis happened.
So as you just heard, because they changed the retirement calculation for Social Security in 1977, this is what fundamentally disrupted the program and made it longer term insolvent. Because again, back to the original argument, if you're putting an appropriate amount of money in and you're getting a risk-free rate of return back, say the government's investing in treasuries and you're getting that money back in retirement, then the program should be sustainable. We shouldn't be worried about demographic trends. The demographic situation's irrelevant if it's properly being stewarded. But in 1977, under the Carter administration, they decided to lock in this really generous benefit. And one of the misconceptions about Social Security, and I thought this, by the way, before my interview with Andrew, one of the misconceptions is that I paid money into the system and I'm going to get my fair share and get my money out of the system, and this is not a social safety net. Fair is fair, and I'm entitled to every penny of benefit that is granted to me. Now, that's not really true. I'm actually being subsidized. The reality is that every American on Social Security is getting a benefit that's way more generous than what would traditional risk-free interest rate would be. And so we are all being subsidized by the Social Security system. And what was initially meant to be a bit of an anti-poverty program in the 1930s has now ballooned into a pension with benefits that are more generous than what the Social Security Administration can pay. And listen, he said this, and this is, I think, a really profound point for all of us to consider, that a retiree today, think about this, a retiree today receives a 40% higher payout compared to a person in the year 2000. And that's because of this generous change to the increase in the Social Security formula that occurred in 1977. And not only was that rule change, not only is it dramatic for us today, but the issues appeared so quickly that by 1983, the Reagan administration had to work with the Democratic Congress and Tip O'Neill, Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill and Reagan had to come together, and they had to figure out a way to reform Social Security, and they did, and that's why they slowly raised the retirement age from 65 to 67, because the benefits were just generous above and beyond what people were actually putting in to the program. The last president to seek to reform Social Security was George W. Bush. By the way, Andrew Biggs was behind the scenes trying to help be one of the he was trying to be one of the architects to help reform the system. Unfortunately, there was not an appetite in Congress at the time. It's really a shame, by the way, that Congress did not get their act together and begin to put in thoughtful reforms then, because the warning then by Andrew and by other smart economists was that we either deal with some small pain now or we deal with more significant pain in the future. Now you fast forward nearly 20 years from that, and now we're dealing with a more significant crisis with Social Security, and the clock is ticking, and 2033 is moving closer and closer. Unfortunately, because of the rule change in 1977, the Social Security program has become, in essence, what I would call a 57-year Ponzi scheme. Because again, more money is going out of the program than is coming in revenues, and eventually that is a house of cards where there's just going to be no money left over. Again, 2033 is that date. Now, before 1977, from 1935 until 1977. There weren't any of these issues, and the reason is that they did not have this automatic generous increase in the benefit formula. And before that, what would happen is that, and I think it was around 9 times that Andrew mentioned this when I interviewed him, but Congress could increase the Social Security benefit on a discretionary ad hoc basis. So, and listen, they were able to balance the effects. They were able to think through the revenues that were coming into the federal government and look at the revenues coming in for Social Security and make a thoughtful determination on what was a sustainable payout to retirees. Where we got off the rails is when we got into these automatic increases that were way above and beyond what was truly sustainable. So something for all of us to be honest about. is that we're getting, frankly, more than our fair share. And interestingly, what came out of this conversation is that I think wealthier Americans are actually, in some ways, being highly subsidized by lower and middle income Americans, which I'll talk about in a moment. But I want you to listen to another clip from Andrew.
I mean, and I think this is the fortunate thing, is if you look at 2033, you say, okay, that's the last year in which Social Security's trust fund will be solvent. Technically 2032, and it runs out in 2033. So that's the last year we got a solvent trust fund. But it's also a first year. It's the first year in which a high-income couple, both making that $168,000 a year, could receive a benefit that is over $100,000 combined.
Wow.
in today's dollars. Now, if you talk about Social Security in any sort of political context, you'll hear phrases like safety net, anti-poverty, blah, blah, blah. Fine. But that's not what is making Social Security expensive. Protecting people against poverty, just as a little mathematical example, let's say we gave every retiree a Social Security benefit set at the poverty threshold. If you do that, you take poverty in old age to zero. Everybody's getting something to take them out of poverty, and you would cut Social Security spending in half. The point is, most of this cost burden is we're paying higher and higher benefits to people who are already the richest retirees in the world.
I think Andrew's point is there's a pretty significant wealth transfer that's occurring to the richest people in the world. And while I'm very supportive of people making good incomes, and I'm a capitalist person, and I think you should go out there and work hard and be properly rewarded for your hard work, and if you get fabulously rich in the process, awesome. But Social Security is not that. Social Security is turning into a bit of a wealth transfer program, and that's making the system insolvent. And the reason that it disproportionately benefits the wealthy is, if you think about it, if they're getting a higher payout to begin with, and that steps up every single year with this benefit increase, they're getting a bigger and bigger and bigger benefit, so that by 2033, a couple is making over $100,000 in Social Security benefits in today's dollars. That's a profound amount of money. There's no one even remotely close to that figure in my practice today that can come close to touching $100,000. So this is an unsustainable statistical path forward. Now think of it simply. The reason this exists, if you think about it in money terms, if you have $1 million and you invest and you make 10%, you're going to get a $100,000 rate of return. But if you invest $100,000 and you get the same 10% rate of return, so you got the exact same rate of return, in real dollar terms, you made 1/10 of the person that had $1 million. Now, that's an extreme example, and there isn't that level of divergence when it comes to Social Security payouts. But I think at least proves the point of why you see a bit of a gap over time, because they're building off of a bigger base. So those benefit increases will lead to bigger and bigger and bigger payouts. And this fundamentally is at the core of the problem of the Social Security system, is that these benefits are above and beyond what's been paid into the program, and it is not solvent. So what happens, by the way, in 2033? What's the math? Here's another clip from Andrew.
Once the trust fund runs out for the retirement program, then the system is about 21% short of the revenues it needs to pay full benefits. And legally, it can't continue paying full benefits unless Congress somehow gets those revenues. So the default position, if we do nothing, is we cut benefits by 21%. Now, some people think that would mean across-the-board benefit cut. I just published a paper recently with a lawyer in D.C. arguing that the president really would have a lot more discretion. They could, protect the lowest income people from falling into poverty, although that means more benefit cuts at the top. But the reality is, that's what's going to happen. And so you need to have some plan for fixing that. And it's easier if you do it today than if you wait until then.
All right, so if Congress does nothing until 2033, and then if they do nothing after 2033, what this effectively means is that you, as a Social Security recipient, will receive a 21% reduction of your benefit. Now, my general take is that they'll either do something in the last minute or they'll do something in 2033. And my guess is that they will reform the Social Security system to an extent, but it probably does mean some sort of a cut to your benefit. And as you heard from the clip, the president does have some power to maneuver relatively quickly, based on the research report that I read that he wrote with a DC attorney. And there's the possibility that the federal government could seek to fund the program. So there's a few ramifications, there's a few outcomes that could happen post 2033. First possibility is everyone just gets a 21% reduction in their benefit. Now, I think that's going to be politically unpalatable and unfeasible. The other thing that the president can work to do is to gather those revenues necessary to fund Social Security fully. But as you're going to hear in a minute, that is going to increase the national debt pretty dramatically. The other possibility, and this is probably the more likely possibility, is that they're going to retain full benefits probably for poor Americans. It'll probably stay a bit of an anti-poverty program. But I think if you are a higher income earner and if you're a middle income earner, there's likely going to be some sort of a reduction in benefit, and they're going to have to reform it for people that have not already retired by 2033. So listen, change is coming for Social Security, and change is coming for you, whether Congress does something or they're forced to do something in 2033 and beyond. But the question is, what if they do decide to fully fund it? How's that going to work? So here's another clip from Andrew. Andrew, any idea of how much in dollar terms we would be short in 2020 or 2033 and 2034, roughly at that 21% mark? What is that as a dollar amount?
If you were, say for 2033, I think it's about $335 billion in today's dollars. So in nominal terms, it would be something higher than that. That's a lot of money. And you quickly get up to the $400 billion range. You don't see very many people proposing, hey, let's have a $400 billion tax increase this year, a $400 billion spending cut. But that's the sort of stuff that you're looking at if you don't want to just drive up the debt. Now, the interesting thing, and I think this is the fortunate thing, is if you look at 2033, you say, okay, that's the last year in which Social Security's trust fund will be solved.
So as you just heard, we're looking at deficit spending of around $400 billion in 2033, above and beyond what could already be excessive deficit spending. And right now, there's been a not very good track record with the last few presidents and members of Congress. There's not been a track record for any sort of fiscal constraint. And so my concern is that if we reach 2033 and we want to pile on another $400 billion to the annual deficit, that may not be something that we're able to do as a country if we don't get the national deficit under control and spending under control. And my concern is you'll either get taxed explicitly or implicitly, or you will see a reduction in benefit for your Social Security explicitly or implicitly. What do I mean? Well, if they don't fully fund the program and a lot of Americans see a reduction in their benefit of 21%, then they'll see a reduction of their benefit in 21%. That's explicit. But the way government spending is going and the way deficit spending is going, I don't know if we can just borrow another $400 billion a year if we continue to do what we've been doing for the last couple of decades by 2033. And if that's the case, then we're going to resort to printing our way out of the situation. And if your benefit doesn't decrease and they're forced to do some reforms to Social Security, like maybe they won't increase it by inflation as much, what I think will happen is implicitly you will have less purchasing power. So maybe they don't reduce your benefit for you, but what will happen is that prices and inflation could be highly problematic if we're having to open the printing presses to fund the government. So if we print our way out of this crisis, you'll just pay it in a hidden tax known as inflation. And so I'd say the biggest takeaway for anyone listening to this podcast today is we should, to an extent, prepare for a reduction of benefit pretty much across the board, especially for middle and upper income Americans. You should prepare for some sort of reduction of benefit in the future if we do nothing. Now, if we're willing to do some reforms in the near term, that gives me a lot of hope, and I think we can adjust our assumptions. So then the question is, all right, well, how do we plan? And the main way I think you can plan, and I've been thinking about this a lot of like, all right, what does this practically mean? Like, what does this mean for you, right? You listener out there that you're looking to retire one day or you're already retired. how do you plan for this? So I came up with a few thresholds. And I do want to stress as a caveat, this is like a general rule of thumb. This is a bit of a gut feel of how I'm assessing the situation. And I don't know the future. You know this, right? I don't know exactly what's going to happen tomorrow, but I think we should make maybe some cautious preparations for the fact that Social Security could look different in the future. So if you are within 10 years of retirement and you probably won't see any cuts to Social Security until 2033, especially if Congress continues to kick the can down the road. So like I said, if you're within, say, 9 to 10 years of retirement, probably not going to see much of a reduction in benefit. But after 2033, one maybe wise way that you could project with financial planning and with retirement planning is maybe assume a 10% haircut if you're upper income or middle class Americans. Okay, so if you're a middle income or upper income Americans, I wouldn't be surprised to see some sort of a reduction in benefit past 2033. I think it's relatively, I shouldn't say safe to assume, but let's put it this way. I think it's likely that those that are near the poverty line and they're using Social Security almost exclusively as their retirement income, that there probably won't be any reduction in benefit. But again, I don't have a crystal ball. But I would say that if you're a low-income earner, you probably don't need to make much of a modification. But if you're a upper-income earner or middle-income earner, then you might want to think about what would your financial plan look like after 2033 if your Social Security benefits were reduced by 10%. I did ask Andrew, by the way, in the middle of the interview, what he thought was reasonable, and he threw out a 10%. That we should project a 10% lower benefit, particularly for pre-retirees. But I think it's not unwise for you to plan for it if you're post-retirement in 2033. Now, what about those of you that are 10 years or more from retirement? All right, so I thought of a few different ways to address this. One is I do think that just from a political feasibility, if we reach a place of insolvency with Social Security in 2033, it's unlikely, in my mind, from a political standpoint, that they're going to take people that are already on the edge of the poverty line and move them into the poverty line by reducing their benefits by 21%. So I think, again, if you are let's say you make $50,000 or less, I have a hard time believing that your benefits are going to be reduced all that much. So if you're 10 years or more from retirement, if you make $50,000 or less, and you're, again, closer to that poverty level, I think it's reasonable to assume that you wouldn't have a reduction of benefit, but it doesn't hurt to at least plan for at least a 10% reduction of benefit. Now, if you're sort of a middle-income American and you're 10 years from retirement, that's where I do think, like Andrew said, start planning for a 10% reduction of benefit at full retirement age. I think you can plan for one of two things. Either you're going to take Social Security at a later age, because maybe they move the age up, not from 67 to at full retirement age, but up to 69. But at a minimum, I think it would be prudent in your financial planning if you project that your benefit will be 10% less than the Social Security statements are telling you right now. Now, if you're an upper income American, this is where I think we might see the biggest change. Again, I don't know how it's going to play out. I don't know what Congress is going to do. All I can do is make rational assumptions about the future. And look, as I explained, if you're an upper income American, you are disproportionately benefiting from Social Security, and you're getting way more out than you put into the system, okay? So this is where I think it would be wise to just assume a 21% reduction of benefit if you are closer to that cap. So by the way, for 2025, the cap is $176,100. That's the point at which they stop taxing you for Social Security. If you are close to that figure as your income or above that figure as your income, it probably is prudent to assume a 21% reduction of benefit. Call it 20 for round math. That's probably a wise way to look at it moving forward. Now, I think what's not wise is and I'm just coming to this revelation myself. I think what's not necessarily wise is to assume zero changes to the program. Something's going to have to turn. Something's going to have to something's going to break. And we're going to have to make adjustments to the program. And so I think it's rational for us as investors, as financial planners, to begin to make some assumptions about the future. We're not going to be dead right, but I think assuming a full benefit, particularly for those that are more than 10 years from retirement, assuming you're going to get the exact same benefit that's being projected now is, I think, unwise in terms of planning. All right. So last point is, what do we do? So I still think there's some hope that we could make some thoughtful reforms to the program. I think if you have any access to your United States senators, send them letters, call their office, reach out to your House representative in Washington, D.C. I think we should begin to demand that Congress stop kicking the can down the road. As a society, we cannot afford for them to wait until 2033. Now, are we going to navigate through this as a nation? We're probably going to do it, which, by the way, if I didn't stress this already, people say, oh, I'm planning on not getting any Social Security at all. I've had a lot of clients come into my office and say, I'll never get Social Security. Well, I don't think that's right either, because you have to remember, when it comes to Social Security, you will definitely, they're going to pay out what comes into the program. It's not as if revenue is going to completely disappear. It's that the revenue coming in from employment taxes will only be 79% of what is owed in 2033. That's why we keep saying it might be wise for upper income Americans to assume that they're going to get a 21% reduction in their benefit. But there still will be a Social Security benefit because there still will be money being added to the system through employment taxes. And thus, it's not like your benefit's going to completely disappear. So I do want to say this. A lot of people come to me and say, I'm planning on no Social Security. We're never going to get it. Well, as long as you pay employment taxes, you probably will get something. So I think it's unwise to be really extreme and assume nothing. And I also think it's unwise to assume there won't be any sort of adjustment to your benefit by 2033, like I said. So that said, I think we should begin to pressure members of Congress. I think both the Republicans and the Democrats have not thought about this carefully, and they've not put in place thoughtful reforms. There have been a few people that have tried to stab at this issue, but not enough members of Congress, because they don't have any political incentive to do so. This is something that's really easy to kick the can down the road and leave it for the next Congress. But we can bring this to the forefront if we start really pressuring members of Congress that we need to do something about this. So we need to make this an issue that makes it very hard for someone to get elected unless they don't begin to address this issue. And we just need to talk about the problems of Social Security now before it gets worse and worse and worse. We have to punish people at the ballot box for not addressing real issues to real innocent people in our country, particularly people that don't make as much money. The other thing is we need to start to demand fiscal constraint in this country as well. Again, if we get to 2033 and our deficit has ballooned even more dramatically from now, and if our debt to GDP ratio climbs up to, say, 150 or 200%, really scary, unsustainable levels, by the way, if we start to get higher and higher and higher, we won't be in a position to fund Social Security. And another theory, and I would encourage you, one other podcast or episode I'd like you to go listen to, not just the Andrew Biggs one, which you have to listen to from last week, but I want you to go listen to the one by Dr. Bob Murphy, who's an amazing podcaster, an amazing economist and thinker. He really exposes that a prominent viewpoint in Washington, D.C. and with policymakers is this idea of modern monetary theory. And there is a group of people, believe it or not, a group of academics that are really starting to espouse the idea that deficit spending is necessary. And by the way, if there's deficit spending, that's just money that's being, in their minds, pushed to the private sector. And so what's red on one side of the column for the government is black in its investment on the other side of the column. I think modern monetary theory is deeply flawed. But the reason I want you to know about it is that this is becoming a very common viewpoint within the halls of Congress, and there's members of the economic the economic council that advises the president. There are major proponents inside Washington, D.C., particularly for the Biden administration, that has been pushing these ideas that we can just continue to spend money and that deficits don't necessarily matter. Now, again, there's gradations with modern monetary theory. I'm really oversimplifying it, and there's people that are more extreme and less extreme. But there is this propensity that people are more and more comfortable with deficit spending. The problem with deficit spending, though, over time is you either borrow more and rack up more crippling debt, but if you can't borrow more, if you decide not to borrow more, then you print your way out of the crisis. And when you start printing your way out of a problem, what you lead to is really nasty inflation. And I think we can all feel it right now. We just went through this in 2023, in 2024. We've dealt with really, and in 2022 when it peaked, we've dealt with some really unpleasant inflation. If we don't deal with the national debt and if we don't begin to engage in any type of fiscal constraint, you can bet that we will deal with long-term systemic inflationary problems, which will eat into whatever benefit that you get in the future with Social Security. So my takeaway is we should pressure people to start being fiscally conservative, and we should also be pressuring members of Congress and the White House to start to tackle this unfolding crisis that is Social Security. I'm hopeful that we can start to deal with this. But I hope this was helpful today regarding Social Security. Again, there's real ramifications for you as an investor. If you have any questions or if you want to know how to project going into the future with your financial plan and how Social Security intersects with it, please don't hesitate to reach out to our office. Thanks again. If you've enjoyed this content and you're looking for a wealth advisor, or if you're a financial advisor and you're looking to make the jump to the independent side, please message me on LinkedIn, or you can email me at drew.benson@bensonwealthmgt.com, or lastly, you can call my office at 603-316-2544. Securities offered through Raymond James Financial Services, Inc., member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services are offered through Raymond James Financial Services Advisors, Inc. Benson Wealth Management and True North Wealth Management Group are not registered broker-dealers, and they are independent of Raymond James Financial Services. The foregoing information has been obtained from sources considered to be reliable, but we do not guarantee that it is accurate or complete. It is not a statement of all available data necessary for making an investment decision, and it does not constitute a recommendation. Any opinions are those of myself and not necessarily those of Raymond James. Expressions of opinion are as of this date and are subject to change without notice. There is no guarantee that these statements, opinions, or forecasts provided herein will prove to be correct. Investing involves risks, and you may incur a profit or loss regardless of strategy selected.